Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday school lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning and welcome to In the Word. We're so glad that you could join us again. We're excited about starting a new quarter today, another 13 lessons, and we're going to get to settle down in one book of the Bible. All these next 13 lessons are going to be from the book of Genesis, and we're looking forward to a wonderful time of study together in God's Word. Dr. Roberts, welcome. Thanks for joining me again.
Good to be here again.
It's been a great team we have going here, and we used to teach Genesis every fall to freshmen,
yes,
right?
for a lot of years.
For many years, for decades, we
right.
taught this together, and so we've been through this material together before and always find it enriching and interesting to do that. The title of the lesson series is God's World and God's People, which is a good title. We have the centrality of God in this story, and this is really the story of God and the world that God creates and the human beings that populate it.
Yeah.
So,
and the book of Genesis, word meaning beginnings, is the beginning of the whole story that goes all the way through Scripture and through history.
It does, and it's interesting that the book of Genesis sets some trajectories that are going to really set the tone, like you say, for the rest of divine history.
Yeah.
There's some trajectories that are set here that are going to be fulfilled not till we come to Jesus.
Right.
And then there are some that are set here that are going to finally be tied up in the book of Revelation when we get back to the garden.
We'll come back to the garden again. That's true.
So we're at the beginning of God's story here, and it's important for us to see that. Now, this book was written for ancient people,
yes.
right? For the Israelite people of old, for the Hebrew people. A long time ago. And one of the things that we're very sensitive to, and we need to be sensitive to, is that we need to read this book in a context that they would have understood, right? Yeah.
Right.
Which has what implications, would you say?
Well, so many times people try to move Genesis into a scientific textbook, and that's not what its purpose was, and not what it was written for.
And it's certainly not a modern book.
No,
in any sense.
not at all.
It's a timely book in what it teaches about God.
It speaks to modern people.
Yes.
It has a message that's amazingly modern,
yeah.
but it's not in modern terms or
so
with the modern
So
pattern.
right from the start, we need to be careful and remind ourselves that we're reading a very ancient book, not a modern scientific perspective. Right. And so we need to read it through that mindset of ancient people who thought of the universe in very different ways than we do.
Yeah.
For instance, they thought of the earth as the center of the universe. And so many scriptural references will kind of imply that the earth was the center and everything revolved around the earth. Well, we know that isn't scientifically the case, but there was still an important spiritual point that could be made in those passages.
Right, and we still speak that way today. When you look around, we talk about the sun rising in the morning and setting in the evening, and we know from all the learning we go through in school and the pictures we have from space that the sun is fixed and we're rotating around it, but that's not the way it looks, and it's not the way it looked to the people in ancient times.
Right. So that's a good example. We can talk about creation, the universe, in ways that don't necessarily represent scientific fact, but they still are meaningful. And there's a lot of that in Genesis as well. The three-tiered universe is another example of that. They thought of the heavens and the surface of the earth and then the underworld.
Right.
And we don't talk that way anymore.
Yeah.
But
you see that coming out in this, in the passage we're looking at for today's lesson. But the question that people had then and still have today is, how did we get here? How'd the world happen? And it was a question that people asked then in ancient times, and not just Hebrew people. There were their neighbors in the Middle East raised the same questions, and they had answers, but they're totally different from what we've got.
They did, and it's so helpful to read some of the other ancient Near Eastern creation stories. The most popular one, the most widespread one, was the one that came out of Babylon. And it's very instructive because not only do the details of the story vary some, but the basic concepts in the stories are different.
Contrast.
The view of God is so different.
Yes.
And the view of the natural world and its value to God, the gods, is so different.
Yeah.
And the human beings and their place in this is all so different.
In Enuma Elish, that ancient account, the gods were terrible.
They were.
And in their vengeful activities with one another, the earth just sort of happened by accident.
Yeah, well, by a violent accident.
Right.
Yeah, the story is that one of the gods was fighting another of the gods and cut the body of the god, which was kind of like a big sea monster, in half, and that became the dome of the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
Well, there was no loving God intentionally creating anything.
Right.
And then maybe we can talk later about where human beings came into that story. But by looking at those contrasting versions of the creation story, we can see that this story firmly puts the emphasis on God as a singular, intentional creator who creates everything out of his own will.
Right.
And it puts the emphasis on creation as being the grand and good creation of a loving and intentional God.
Yes. The thing I used to stress to students in class as we started looking at Genesis is that the book of Genesis talks about creation not from a perspective of how, in terms of the details of the process used, or when, as far as dating or the time period involved, but it emphasizes who made the world and why. The fact that it was good, it was intentional, there was a purpose.
Yeah.
And that is such a contrast to the ancient world.
Yeah. And, you know, we've used the word questions, the questions that we bring here a number of times. There are many good questions. There are fine questions that occur to us out of our human curiosity. You mentioned a few. When did creation occur? How long ago did it occur? How long did it take? These aren't bad questions. They come out of our natural curiosity. But they aren't the best questions.
Right.
And by best, I mean they aren't the questions that Genesis is trying to answer for us. And so we need to match our questions to the text here. And what we end up with is something so much more wonderful than how long ago did it happen and how long did it take. We get an intimate picture of our Creator and of God's intentions for creation, including God's intentions for ourselves.
And the account given to us in Genesis, for the Hebrew people, it was a poetic way of describing things. It was not intended to be scientific, but it was still accurate in the sense that it's saying who did it and the fact that it was good.
I like a phrase that I've heard you use. It's factual, but it's also faith-based. It's not that it's, when you say poetic, we don't mean it's fictional and invented. It's based on the facts of creation. But the main point of it is not just scientific fact. The main point of it is to bolster and focus our faith in God as our Creator.
Yeah.
Well, these are some of the perspectives we're going to bring to Genesis. Our lesson today is the first 13 verses, so why don't you read that and we can chat about it.
Okay, that's from the NIV. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day.
Well, that's where our lesson stops for today. We'll get days 4, 5, 6, and 7 next time, right?
Okay.
Yeah, the next couple of lessons. Well, the first 2 verses set the stage for all of this creative activity. We have this wonderful phrase, "in the beginning," which is going to turn up again in one of the Gospels. In the New Testament, in the writings of John. Yeah.
Yes.
So here, this phrase is not, it is a time reference, but it's not a specific time reference, is it? It's, some people over the years have tried to pinpoint the exact date of creation, but those efforts have been largely discredited. We just don't have enough information. And it doesn't really enhance our awe at the power of God's creation to pinpoint the date of it.
No.
Just say, when it all began, and God was there doing it. This phrase does give us the title for this first book of the Bible.
The beginnings.
Yeah, Genesis means beginning. It's a Greek word, and the Hebrew title was "in the beginning." But right here, before anything else, we get the name God.
Right.
And it is that that very common word that was used widely around the ancient Near East, Elohim, rather than the distinctive Israelite name for God.
The name El you'll find frequently in names because it was a recognition of deity.
Yeah, yeah. Some people might have picked up the fact that the word Elohim is plural. And that can be confusing to some people, as it was to me when I first learned that. Why would the name of God be plural? One possibility that comes to people's minds is that, well, maybe it's more than one God, but that's completely impossible in this text, in this setting. It is a plural word, but it's not being used in a plural way.
And the emphasis throughout Scripture is that God is one, and that becomes a very strong part of it.
Well, and clearly we're meant to read this in the singular because the verb is also singular. You wouldn't know from the English,
it's
but
a name.
Yeah, it's become. So that shouldn't be confusing. This is not polytheism here. No. Well, God created everything that is, the heavens and the earth, which is the phrase that the writer of Genesis uses for the whole universe, the whole cosmos, all creation, the heavens and the earth. And this word heavens here is not heaven, is it?
Right, not with a capital H.
Yeah, right. The word heavens refers to the skies and everything up above us. Space, yes, that's space. So we have everything. And at first, the earth existed as kind of a dark, watery, chaotic area.
It was a watery chaos.
And darkness characterized it. But most importantly, what else was there besides water and darkness?
Well, when God entered the picture and it was there, that it changed everything.
God created all that existed, and God was present in all that existed. Even in this initial dark, chaotic condition of the universe, God's presence was there, hovering almost like a bird above all of this. That word spirit literally means breath or wind. And the concept of breath is very important in the Genesis account. We're going to see it later with the creation of animals and humans with the breath of life. So here, the breath of God or the wind of God beat, as it were, over the face of the waters.
And we're going to be looking at chapter 2 later in subsequent lessons. But there's a contrast in chapter 1 and chapter 2 as far as how the world was. Chapter 1 emphasizes this watery, dark chaos. Chapter 2 seems to indicate a dry thing that needed water. And so you've got both as God creating something good out of what needed to be changed.
An incomplete existence. And God was active in that. Well, these two verses are very important for what they teach us about God, which I think is the main purpose for Genesis. I mean, these opening chapters about creation. It's not, as you said earlier, it's not when or how long, it's who. And so let's pause and say, what do we learn about God from these opening two verses? I'll start it off. We learn that God is a powerful creator. We see the power of God and in His creative work. Anything else we should
He was very
mention?
Involved in the creation.
There you go.
Since the the Spirit hovering over the surface, it was in the process.
Right, and so it's not like those other creation stories where God's creative work wasn't really creative. It was the universe was the accidental byproduct of a meaningless action of violence. Here, God is not only powerful, but over creation. He's present in creation in an intimate way. Well, those are two really, really important points to make about God that come out of these opening verses. Well, now we enter a period of these so-called days where we see a number of themes as God brings order to this chaos.
Separating, gathering, directing.
Let's talk about that. There's a lot of emphasis on God bringing order to creation. And so one of the verbs we look for is separate. Separated.
Darkness from light.
Darkness from light, water from dry. And we're going to see more separating going on throughout this. Then you mentioned another word, gathered, right? What was it? That's the seas.
Gathering the seas and gathering the
gathering the seas, separated from the dry land. That's an ordering going on. And I got to thinking, even these periods of time, day 1, day 2, that's a kind of ordering, a kind of a chronological ordering that brings a step-by-step approach to what God is doing in creation.
And we'll notice that these first 3 days set the scene for the next 3 days. He'll gather and intentionally direct even more subsequently, based on what happens these 3.
Let's give one example so people know what you mean. Day 1 is the creation of light energy.
But not sun.
But day 4 is the creation of light-giving objects like the sun and the moon and the stars. So, so this is a lengthy process of increasing ordering of creation. Yeah. So there's that orderliness. The other theme that we see all through these 3 days and beyond is the innate goodness of creation. And that cannot be overestimated.
God saw that was good.
Yeah. So I heard a sermon once entitled, "God don't make no junk."
Yeah.
God don't make no junk. Everything that God is doing here is good. And that, along with the emphasis on God and God's purpose and presence and power, is this emphasis on the inherent goodness of all that God has created.
And that's important for us still, to be able to recognize from this account of creation that our view of the world needs to recognize it is basically good. God made it that way.
Yeah. Many people talk about the negative effects of human sin, both on human beings and on the world in which we live. And I don't disagree with that. That is true. But I think we need to start with the notion that the universe, as God created it, was good and intentionally good, and God valued it as good. And so we need to take God's perspective on everything,
right,
including the natural world. So there's the orderliness theme here. There's the goodness theme that we have here. There's another interesting theme, which is that whenever possible, God creates creativity into creation.
Yes.
And that comes out down in verse 11, where God instructs the land to produce the vegetation.
Yeah.
It doesn't say, and God said, let there be plants. What God said was, let the land produce. And that's a theme that we're going to see played out in our next lesson. And that to me, not only is creation, should we value creation as good, as inherently good, but we should recognize it as inherently creative, like God is.
Yeah.
And so are we in that sense.
He's built that into the system.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking about some themes that go through these 3 days. Let's go back and look at each day separately now and see what else we want to mention.
One thing that we need to be sure to talk about, and that's this word vault, or expanse, or firmament, or dome. We have all these different words in trying to explain the three-tiered world.
Right. You're in verses 6 and 7 and 8 here.
Yeah.
The NIV text has the word vault. The King James has firmament.
English Standard Version has expanse.
And then the RSV has
dome. Right.
And I've also seen bowl somewhere, an upside down bowl. So the translators are really struggling here, aren't they, to find an English word. So what do you think we're trying to picture here?
The point is that what they're saying is that God separated waters above and below and made the world.
Yeah.
And above there's this water. And when we get to the story of Noah, it talks about the windows of heaven being opened and the water gushing. It wasn't just rain, it was really coming in from beneath as well. But the dome or the expanse or the firmament separates those waters above from the waters below. And the dry land then is made to appear and so forth.
I picture this as what we call the atmosphere, which includes its clouds. Some people picture it as an ancient fixed dome, a hard dome that eventually got broken through. I think what this is an attempt to do is to describe the atmosphere does look kind of like a bowl over us, even though we know it's not a bowl. So I think atmosphere is the way we should think of this, separating the atmospheric waters, the water vapor in the clouds, from the oceanic waters that are on the surface of the earth. Well,
we skipped over the first day.
We didn't mention light, but you've already mentioned a very important point, that this is not the creation of the sun. This is light that's going on here. You know, we haven't talked at all about the word day, which pops up here often. Maybe let's do that before we run out of time. There's quite a debate that goes on this matter of how we should read the word day. Should we read it as a 24-hour day, and or should we read it as a more indeterminate length of time? I lean toward the more indeterminate period of time.
Since there was no sun,
there is no sun.
Have to.
We can't have a 24-hour day yet, can we? And besides, the word day in these opening chapters is widely used not to mean an exact 24-hour period. For instance, in verse 5, early in verse 5, it says, he called the light day. In other words, day can be used just to describe a period of light. It doesn't have to be a 24-hour period. And when we get over just to chapter 2, verse 4, it says, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Well, that's not a 24-hour period. That was a period of creativity. An indeterminate period of creativity. So, but at any rate, we don't want to get in an argument about that, but it seems from Genesis itself that the word day is used a little more generically.
And the light and darkness is not the evil and good contrast that we find later on, as much as the difference from chaos to the daylight, where you
and then the orderliness of that, separating it. By the way, evening and morning, we usually think morning and evening. Well, why do you think it says
the Hebrew day began at night, and then you have the daylight after, and that emphasis of resting and then going into the day is their perspective. And we get to the seventh day, we'll see that rest was important. Yeah,
that's a good example of how the book of Genesis was written for a certain group of people from their perspective, and here their perspective of the pattern of a day.
Evening,
first, then evening, then the morning. Well, let's wrap things up here. We talked about the big questions, and we've got some big answers from this passage, I think. God is the creator, purposeful, powerful, and very personally involved. And what God created is just amazing in its own creativity and in its inherent goodness. And those are some pretty important takeaways, I think.
They really are. And, you know, our current generation maybe overuses the word awe and awesome. But it is awe-inspiring to look at the world and realize what God has made. And because of the testimony here in Genesis, we recognize that as believers in God, we have to look at the world basically as good. He made it good. It's beautiful. There are disasters. There are things that are not good. But the world still basically is the way God made it.
Right. That's an excellent point. These verses inspire us to a renewed sense of awe in God as the Creator and kind of the foundation of our faith, and also a deep, deep respect for the universe in which we live. And if anybody cares for creation, it should be Christians.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, we're so grateful that you joined us today. I know this was an old familiar passage, but it feels like every time we come back to it, we find some fresh insights and get some old convictions renewed. And so we're grateful that you could join us today. I hope you come back next week when we continue our study in Genesis. Have a great week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.